3 years after my wife's death, I thought the worst was over, until a sudden call from my lawyer froze me in place. A secret letter she'd hidden before dying exposed a plan already unfolding inside my own home. I stayed silent, gathered proof, and prepared my move, but the final reveal came from where no one expected. Before I take you through every detail of how this unfolded, do me a small favor. Tap subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps these stories travel farther than you think. I was seated in my study, the familiar smell of polished wood, and old paper grounding me as I reviewed quarterly statements from accounts I'd spent decades building. The phone vibrated on the desk. I glanced at the screen and felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with age. The caller ID showed the name of my estate attorney, a man I'd trusted for more than 20 years. He never called casually. "Elliot," he said when I answered. His voice was low, controlled, but urgent in a way I'd never heard before. "I need you to come to my office today. Alone. There's something I need to show you." My eyes drifted to the window, to the rolling hills beyond the glass, where trees were just beginning to burn gold and rust. "What is it?" I asked. "It concerns a safe deposit box," he replied. "One that belonged to your wife. We only just discovered it." The words hit like a quiet blow. My wife had been gone 3 years. A swift, merciless illness. 6 months from diagnosis to goodbye. We had shared 42 years together. Long enough to believe there were no secrets left between us. A safe deposit box. I repeated. She never mentioned anything like that. "I know," Elliot said. "That's why I need you here. 2 o'clock. Please." The drive into town passed in a blur. Our home sat on 5 acres outside Willowbrook, a place we'd built from the ground up. White stone, wide windows, a promise of permanence. 30 years running my dental practice. For decades of marriage. I believed we were transparent with each other, anchored by trust. At exactly 2, I sat across from Elliot in his office, the hum of traffic muted by thick glass. He placed a small cream-colored envelope on the desk between us. My name was written on the front in a handwriting I knew better than my own. "She rented the box years ago," he said quietly, "at a branch she used before you moved out to the state, during a system audit. The bank realized the annual fees were still being charged to an old account. They contacted me as executor. I didn't touch the envelope yet. My hand stayed folded in my lap, as if moving too quickly might shatter something fragile. "What's inside?" "Just this," he said, sliding the envelope closer. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. I recognized it instantly. Cream paper with a faint embossed border she'd always favored. The day at the top made my throat close. 3 weeks before she died. "My dearest Elliot," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. There's something I need to tell you. Something I couldn't bring myself to say when I was alive." I felt heat behind my eyes as I continued. 2 months ago, while I was in the hospital, I overheard the boys talking outside my room. They thought I was asleep. I wasn't. My breath caught. The letter went on, steady and precise, as if she poured all her remaining strength into clarity. Our older son asked how much longer I had. His brother answered without hesitation. "A few months, maybe less. Then we can focus on Dad." I stopped reading and looked up at Elliot. He watched me carefully, his expression grave. "There's more," he said gently. I forced myself to continue. "They've been planning since I got sick. The investment our eldest keeps asking you about, it isn't real. I had a friend look into it. There's no registered company, only a website, and your younger son's debts are worse than you know. I found statements while searching for his insurance information. The number is just over 47,000. My fingers trembled. The room felt suddenly smaller. They'll tell you they need help." The letter continued. "They'll say it's temporary. They'll make you feel guilty for having security when they're struggling. But listen to me, Elliot. I've watched them their whole adult lives. They don't stand on their own. We made it too easy. I made it too easy." I swallowed hard and read the final lines. "They're waiting for me to die so they can convince you to give them everything. Please don't let them. Protect yourself. Protect what we built. I love you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to say this to your face. I set the paper down with care, as though it might crumble if handled roughly. When did she write this? I asked. Mid-July, Elliot replied. She passed 3 weeks later. She had carried this knowledge while smiling at me, while holding my hand, while saying goodbye. For legal purposes, I said slowly, "Is this enough?" He leaned back, fingers steepled. It establishes intent and timeline, combined with other evidence. It could be very important, but I need to ask you something. He paused. Has anything happened since her passing that matches what she described? I didn't answer right away. Images rose unbidden. Our eldest moving into the basement suite temporarily to get his venture off the ground. The younger one and his wife settling into the guest cottage just until things stabilized. Requests that started small and grew bolder. Promises that never materialized. Yes, I said at last. Everything. Elliot opened a drawer and handed me a business card. I think you should speak to this man. Former federal investigator. Discreet. Thorough. The card felt heavier than paper should. Accepting it meant acknowledging that my wife's warning wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. On the drive home, memories rearranged themselves into a new pattern. Hospital visits where questions about wills came too easily. Conversations whispered in corners. The house looked the same when I pulled into Circular Drive. Imposing, immaculate, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt occupied. Laughter drifted from inside. The television was on. I didn't stop. I walked straight to my study, closed the door, and turned the lock. The click echoed louder than it should have. I dialed the number on the card. 3 days later, I met the investigator at a cafe 20 minutes from my home. He was unassuming, sharp-eyed, and prepared. He slid a folder across the table. I did some preliminary digging, he said. What I found confirms your wife's concerns. He showed me records, screenshots, timelines. The so-called startup existed only online. No filings, no employees. The address led to a shipping store. Then came the gambling accounts. The totals matched the letter exactly. She knew. I whispered. There's more, he said. If you agree, I recommend discreet audio monitoring in shared spaces. Nothing invasive, just enough to document intent. I thought of the letter again. Of 3 years of being slowly drained. Do it, I said. When I returned home that evening, the house buzzed with routine sounds, footsteps, voices, doors closing. None of them noticed a shift that had already begun. And as I sat alone in my study, listening to autumn wind brush against the windows, I understood one thing with terrifying clarity. The storm wasn't coming. It was already inside the house. The equipment went in quietly, the way all decisive things seem to happen, without drama, without witnesses. 2 technicians arrived mid-morning while both households were out. They wore plain jackets, moved with practiced efficiency, and spoke only when necessary. Smoke detectors were opened and resealed. A clock radio was adjusted by a fraction of an inch. A picture frame was lifted, set back into place with a soft click. Nothing looked different when they left, yet the house had changed in a fundamental way. It was no longer just where I lived. It was now a place that would tell the truth. For the first several days, there was nothing worth noting. Background noise, television chatter, music drifting through vents. Footsteps, doors, ordinary life. I listened late into the night, headphones pressing into my ears, half hoping I'd hear nothing more than proof that my wife had been wrong, that this entire spiral could still end with relief instead of confrontation. But doubt has a way of settling into the bones. On the 6th evening, after dinner, dishes clinked downstairs and voices gathered in the great room. I sat in my study and pressed play on the most recent file. At first, it was just laughter. Then one voice cut through with unmistakable confidence. I'm telling you, my older son said, relaxed, amused. We can stretch this another year easily. Maybe 2 if we're careful. Another laugh followed, shorter, sharper. His brother. As long as she keeps him thinking we're trying to find our own place, he'll keep believing we're saving. A woman's voice joined in, curious, casual. So, when do you ask again about the money? Not yet, my son replied. You don't rush these things. The trick is making him feel like it's his idea. I felt something cold move through my chest, slow and deliberate. I didn't pause the recording. I didn't breathe. There was the sound of a drink being set down, ice clinking softly. Once he's gone, the younger one said, lowering his voice, everything splits between us anyway. But if we play this right, that's just a bonus. How much are we talking? The woman asked. 40 for the business, my eldest said without hesitation. 35 for the debt cleanup. That's 75 on top of what's coming later. Plus the insurance already paid out, his brother added. That part's done. The real prize is the house and the accounts. Over $2 million. We just need to keep playing the part. There was a pause. Then another woman spoke, confident, dismissive. He won't remarry. He's still stuck in grief mode. That works in our favor. I removed the headphones slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter the moment. The room was silent, except for the hum of my computer. Outside the window, leaves detached themselves from branches and drifted down, one by one. They had been planning this. Not reacting. Not improvising. Planning. For 3 years. I sat there until long after the voices downstairs faded and doors closed. When I finally stood, my knees felt stiff, unfamiliar. I walked to the window and looked out over the ground my wife and I had chosen together. The guest cottage glowed softly with light. The basement windows were lit. 2 occupied territories inside what I believed was my home. The next morning, I called Elliot. I have what I need, I said. Audio, financial records, her letter. I want everything locked down. He was quiet for a moment. You understand what this will cost you. I understand what it already has. We discussed options, protections, boundaries that could not be crossed once established, an irrevocable trust, asset transfers, legal notices, consequences that could not be argued away with emotion. And I want eviction proceedings started. I added, both residences. That will be final, he said. It already is. Over the next week, documents arrived by courier. I read them late at night, every clause, every stipulation. The trust placed everything I owned under professional management. The house, the accounts, the investments. Upon my death, distributions were precise and minimal where required, with the remainder directed outward, to causes my wife and I had supported quietly for years. When I signed the final page, something inside me loosened. Not joy, relief. The eviction notices were drafted next. Formal, unyielding, 60 days. No negotiation. I chose to serve them myself. I told them it was a family dinner, the first in years. They arrived smiling, expectant. They thought this was the moment everything shifted back in their favor. I watched them closely as we ate. Not one of them asked how I was. They were waiting. After dessert, I placed 2 envelopes on the table. What's this? My eldest asked, already opening his. Color drained from his face. The younger one tore his open, eyes moving quickly across the page. His wife's hand flew to her mouth. This can't be serious, he said. We're family. I opened my laptop and pressed play. Their own voices filled the room. Calm, calculating, confident. Silence followed, thick and heavy. This has been going on for 3 years. I said evenly, your mother knew. She tried to warn me. I read her letter aloud, every word. By the time I finished, no one was looking at me anymore. There's more, I continued. I've secured everything. You'll receive the legal minimum when I'm gone. Nothing beyond that. One of the women laughed nervously. You can't do that. I already have. Chaos erupted. Accusations. Pleas. Anger. I left the room, locked myself into my study, and began documenting the evening. Dates. Times. Statements. Everything. The knocking came later. Apologies. Promises. Offers to change. I said nothing. When they finally left, the house fell silent again. Truly silent. The next 8 weeks unfolded like a slow, predictable storm. Attempts to intimidate, to guilt, to manipulate. Each one failed. Lawyers withdrew. Mediators gave up. Doors closed. On the final morning, deputies arrived. The removals were orderly, almost dull. Boxes carried out. Doors shut. Keys returned. I watched from the window as the vehicles disappeared down the drive. The house exhaled. I walked through every room afterward. Opened windows. Let air and light reclaim the space. It wasn't empty. It was mine again. The first night after they left, I didn't sleep. Not because the house felt empty, but because it finally felt honest. Every sound had weight again. The settling of old beams, the faint tick of clock in the hall, wind pressing against windows like a question. I moved from room to room, a mug of cold tea, touching familiar surfaces, as if reacquainted myself with a place I'd been visiting rather than living in. The study door stood open. No lock needed anymore. By morning, the calls began. They didn't come directly at first. That would have required courage. Instead, they arrived wrapped in concern, disguised as mediation, old friends of the family, distant relatives. People who hadn't visited in years suddenly found time to check in. Each conversation followed the same arc. Confusion, disbelief, gentle pressure to reconsider. You don't want to do something you'll regret. One said, "They're your sons." Another reminded me, as if biology were a blanket excuse. I listened politely, thanked them for caring, and declined to discuss private legal matters. When one persisted, I ended the call. By the end of the week, my phone was quiet again. The silence didn't last. On the 8th day, a letter arrived by courier. Heavy paper. Legal letterhead. Accusations dressed up as concern. Claims of undue influence. Emotional distress. Even hints of coercion. I forwarded it to Elliot without comment. His response came that evening. "We'll reply tomorrow. They don't have a case." 2 days later, their attorney withdrew representation. That was when tactics changed. Flowers arrived next. A large arrangement left on the front step without a note. I placed it in the guest cottage and closed the door. The following afternoon, my older son appeared unannounced, holding a smaller bouquet, his expression carefully rehearsed. "I just want to talk," he said when I opened the door. I accepted the flowers, stepped back inside, and closed the door again. The lock clicked softly. He stood there for a full minute before leaving. The week after that, his brother tried a different approach. A call from his wife, voice shaking, claiming a medical scare brought on by stress. I sent a basket of fruit to the hospital listed and made no visit. There was no follow-up. On the 4th week, they escalated. A counselor arrived at my gate one afternoon, accompanied by both couples. They stood together, unified for once, faces tight with determination. I watched from the window as the counselor rang the bell. When I didn't answer, she rang again. I called the police. By the time officers arrived, the group had dispersed, leaving behind a business card and a handwritten note asking me to reconsider before it's too late. I handed both to Elliot. Every attempt was documented. Dates, times, witnesses, patterns. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery moved steadily forward. Discovery requests revealed more than I expected. Financial records surfaced, showing that the supposed startup had been pitched to colleagues I'd once mentored. Small sums here and there. Enough to sting, not enough to trigger alarms. Enough to establish a pattern. The gambling debts, too, were worse than the initial number. New accounts, old ones reopened, payments made with borrowed money, lies stacked on top of lies. When the lawsuit was filed, the response was immediate. Anger, denial, then fear. Wage garnishment notices followed the judgment. Bankruptcy filings came shortly after. The debt survived them anyway. I didn't attend the hearings. Elliot represented me fully. I read transcripts later, factual and dry, stripped of drama. The judge's ruling was concise. Back rent owed, damages awarded, costs assigned, consequences enforced. Outside the courtroom, there were no speeches, no final pleas, just paperwork. While all this unfolded, I made changes of my own. The security system went in quietly. Cameras, sensors, panic buttons. Documentation over deterrence. I wanted records, not alarms. The investigator oversaw the installation personally. When it was done, he walked me through the feeds. "You're covered," he said simply. The first night it was active, I slept soundly. As winter approached, I found myself restless in the mornings. The house no longer demanded vigilance. It asked something else of me now. Movement. Purpose. I started volunteering twice a week at the oncology center where my wife had spent her final months, not in any official capacity. I helped families navigate forms, sat with patients during long infusions, fetched coffee when words failed. It was quiet work, necessary work. People didn't ask about my life there. They were too busy living theirs. Between shifts, I traveled, not far at first. A coastal town in early spring. A week walking old streets we once planned to see together. I took photos of places she would have loved and wrote her letters I never sent, folded them carefully and placed them in a drawer. By summer, the house felt too large again, not because of ghosts, but because it belonged to a different chapter. I put it on the market, without ceremony. When an offer came quickly, I accepted. The day I signed the sale papers, I felt lighter than I had in years. I moved into a smaller place just outside town. 3 bedrooms. Enough land for privacy, not isolation. The trust remained intact. The scholarships funded. The causes supported. On the anniversary of the eviction, I visited the cemetery alone, brought her favorite flowers, sat on the bench and spoke aloud, unafraid of being overheard. "You were right," I told her, "about everything." I read her letter again, the laminated edges worn soft from handling, folded it carefully and returned it to my wallet. Driving home, I stopped at a cafe on impulse, ordered her drink, sat by the window, and watched the world move past. Ordinary lives, ordinary problems, a strange comfort. That evening, a call came from my new attorney. Applications had arrived for the scholarship fund bearing her name. Dozens of them. Stories of perseverance, of need, of hope. I asked him to send them all. As night settled in, I opened my journal and wrote without pause. Not out of anger, not out of grief, but out of clarity. Everything was documented now. Everything accounted for. And for the first time in years, nothing was waiting in the shadows. The house sold faster than I expected. 3 showings, 2 offers, 1 decision. On the final walkthrough, I stood alone in the great room while the agent checked details in the kitchen. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, lighting dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. I remember my wife standing in that same spot years earlier, laughing as we argued about where to place the piano we never bought. Memory, I realized, doesn't live in walls. It lives in what we choose to carry forward. Moving day was quiet. No dramatics. No second thoughts. I took what mattered and left the rest. Furniture was donated, books boxed and given away. The last thing I removed from the study was the desk chair. I stood for a moment in the empty room, then turned out the light. The smaller house welcomed me without pretense. Clean lines, manageable space, silence that felt earned rather than imposed. I unpacked slowly, intentionally. Each item found a place. Each drawer closed with a sense of finality. The first month passed gently. Mornings began with walks along the property line. Afternoons were spent volunteering or reviewing scholarship applications. Evenings were mine. Sometimes I cooked. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I simply sat and listened to the quiet. Then the messages started. They came through channels I hadn't blocked. New numbers. Emails routed through intermediaries. Each carried the same undertone. Unresolved anger wrapped in obligation. You didn't have to go this far. We're still family. You'll regret this when it's too late. I didn't respond. I forwarded everything to my attorney and documented each attempt. Patterns emerged. Timing clustered around court deadlines, payment schedules, holidays. Predictable. One message arrived late one night from an unfamiliar address. Short, direct. This isn't finished. I deleted it. Winter deepened. Snow gathered on bare branches. The property looked like a sketch stripped of color. Inside, the house remained warm, orderly. I hosted no one. I explained nothing. The lawsuit moved forward without me. Depositions were taken, records examined, testimony given. When the judgment came down, I read it once, folded the paper, and placed it in the file labeled resolved. Wage garnishment notices followed. Bankruptcy filings confirmed. The machinery did what it was designed to do. I took no satisfaction in it, only closure. Spring arrived early that year. Buds pushed through frost with quiet insistence. I planted a small garden behind the house. Herbs, tomatoes, flowers my wife had loved but never had time to tend. Digging in the soil felt grounding, honest. One afternoon, while trimming back dead branches, I noticed a car parked at the edge of the drive. I didn't recognize it. It stayed there longer than necessary. When I stepped onto the porch, it drove away. I checked the cameras. The plate was recorded. I forwarded it to the investigator. Nothing actionable yet, he said later. But you did the right thing. The incident unsettled me more than I expected. Not fear, awareness. Old habits resurfacing. I doubled down on routine. Locks checked. Logs updated. Life continued. In early summer, I received a letter from the court clerk confirming the final disbursement schedule. The amounts were precise, impersonal, effective. I filed it away. A week later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a framed photograph of the old house, taken from the road. Recent. A note taped to the back read simply, "Remember where you came from." I sat at the kitchen table, holding it for a long time. Then I placed the photo back in the box, sealed it, and labeled it evidence. Another file, another record. That night, I slept deeply. The scholarship committee met for the first time in July. We reviewed applications one by one. Stories unfolded across the table. Students who had lost parents, who worked nights to pay tuition, who wanted to practice medicine or dentistry in underserved communities. My wife's name appeared on every page, not as a memory, but as an opportunity. We selected the first recipients unanimously. I attended the award ceremony quietly, sitting in the back. When the students spoke, gratitude in their voices, I felt something settle inside me. This was legacy, not property, not money, impact. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She thanked me by name, eyes bright, hands trembling slightly. "I promise I won't waste this," she said. "I know," I replied. That promise mattered more than anything my sons had ever said. Late that summer, I ran into an old colleague at the grocery store. We chatted briefly. As we parted, he hesitated. "I heard about what happened," he said carefully. "With your boys." I waited. "I just wanted you to know," he continued. "You did the right thing. A few of us were taken in by that so-called business pitch. We didn't know how to tell you." I thanked him and moved on. Driving home, I realized something important. The shame I carried wasn't mine to hold anymore. The final contact came in early autumn. A formal letter requesting mediation. One last attempt to reopen discussions. I declined through counsel. The response was immediate and furious, but short-lived. Then nothing. Months passed without incident. The seasons turned. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, honest. On the anniversary of my wife's passing, I returned to the cemetery, sat on the bench, spoke aloud, unembarrassed by the sound of my own voice. I kept my word. I told her. I listened. The wind moved through the trees. Leaves fell softly around me. Driving home, I didn't look back. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was layered, built from routine, intention, and the absence of chaos I had realized had been exhausting me for years. Days passed without interruption. Weeks followed. I learned the sound of my new house, the way you learn a language by immersion. The soft creak of the hallway at dawn, the way the kitchen window rattled when the wind shifted from the west, the low hum of the refrigerator late at night, when the rest of the world seemed to pause. I settled into habits that required no defense. Mornings began early. I made coffee the way my wife had taught me, measured, patient, deliberate. I read the paper at the kitchen table. No television on, no background noise competing for attention. The headlines came and went, none of them urgent enough to pierce the calm I was building. Twice a week, I drove into town to volunteer. The oncology center smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, a combination that once would have tightened my chest. Now it felt purposeful. I learned which patients preferred silence and which needed conversation to distract from the hours tethered to machines. I memorized names. I learned stories. I listened. People told me things they didn't tell their families, fears they couldn't voice at home, regrets that surfaced only in the quiet. I didn't offer advice. I offered presence. It was enough. On the drive back, I often took the long way. Past fields where crops shifted with the seasons. Past houses where children played in yards, and couples argued quietly on porches. Ordinary lives unfolding without ceremony. I envied none of it. I simply observed. The lawsuit faded into the background, reduced to scheduled deductions and automated notices. Occasionally, my attorney would forward an update, confirmation of payments received, documentation compliance. Each message required no response from me. The system functioned without my involvement. Once, curiosity got the better of me. I asked how they were managing. Barely, my attorney replied. But they're compliant. That's what matters. I didn't ask for details. Knowing more wouldn't change anything. Late one afternoon, while organizing files in my home office, I came across a box I hadn't opened since the move. Inside were old photographs, decades of them, trips, holidays, birthdays, smiles frozen in time, untroubled by what would come later. I sat on the floor and sorted through them slowly. There were pictures of my sons as children, mud on their knees, wide grins, arms thrown around each other. Moments when they had been exactly what they were meant to be. I didn't feel anger looking at those images. Only a quiet sadness for the distance between then and now. I kept a few. I returned the rest of the box and stored it away. That night, I dreamed of my wife. Not sick, not fragile. She stood in a place I didn't recognize, sunlight behind her, smiling the way she did when she knew something I didn't. When I woke, the feeling lingered, not grief but reassurance. Summer edged toward autumn again. The garden behind the house flourished despite my amateur care. Tomatoes ripened faster than I could eat them. I shared the surplus with neighbors I barely knew. Polite exchanges turned into conversations. Names were learned. Boundaries respected. One neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars pass slowly by the property weeks earlier. I thanked him and checked the footage. Nothing recent. No patterns. Still, I remained aware. Awareness, I'd learned, wasn't the same as fear. The scholarship fund grew. Donations arrived from people who had never met my wife, but resonated with the mission. Each application cycle brought new stories, new possibilities. I read every one personally, long into the night, marking notes in the margins. Potential, determination, character. The committee trusted my judgment. I didn't take that lightly. In October, I was invited to speak briefly at a small ceremony recognizing donors. I declined the podium but agreed to attend. When my name was mentioned, polite applause followed. I remained seated. This wasn't about recognition. It was about continuity. After the event, a man approached me, older than me by a few years, posture slightly stooped. He introduced himself quietly. "I was in business with your boys," he said. Briefly, I waited. "I lost money," he continued. "Not much, but enough to sting. I wanted you to know I don't blame you. You handled it the way I wish I had." He shook my hand and walked away. The encounter unsettled me in an unexpected way. Not because of the confirmation, but because it closed a loop I hadn't known was open. Another piece of the past acknowledged, then released. As winter returned, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what was ahead. Travel plans formed without guilt. I booked a spring trip overseas, following an itinerary my wife and I had sketched out years earlier. I packed lightly. I carried her letter with me anyway. On the plane, somewhere over the Atlantic, I reread it again. The words were familiar now, worn smooth by repetition. They no longer cut. They guided. The trip was quiet and reflective. I walked through places we had only imagined. I ate meals slowly, watching strangers converse in languages I didn't understand. I wrote postcards I never mailed. I took photographs I didn't share. When I returned home, the house welcomed me back without judgment. The first sign that things weren't entirely finished came in late March. A letter arrived from a debt collection agency, addressed incorrectly but clearly meant to provoke. I forwarded it to my attorney. He replied within the hour. "They're attempting to circumvent garnishment," he wrote. "It won't work." 2 weeks later, another message arrived, this time through a social media platform I rarely used. The account was newly created. No profile photo, just a single sentence. "You think you've won." I didn't respond. I closed the app and deleted it entirely. Patterns, once recognized, lose their power. By May, the garden was alive again. New growth pushing through soil I turned with my own hands. The rhythm of planting and tending grounded me in a way nothing else had. Life continuing because it could. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft orange, I sat on the porch and realized something profound. I hadn't thought about them all day. Not once. No flash of anger. No flicker of concern. Just space. Freedom, I understood, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, then stayed. I went inside, opened my journal, and wrote a single line. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the absence of obligation to it. I closed the book and turned off the light. By the time summer returned, I had learned something important about distance. It doesn't erase the past, but it does reduce its volume. The memories were still there, sharp in places, softened in others, but they no longer shouted over present. They existed the way old scars do, noticeable only when you choose to look. That illusion of calm lasted until the first certified letter arrived. It came on a Monday, delivered mid-morning, the envelope stiff and unmistakably official. My name was typed precisely, the return address unfamiliar. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the kitchen counter, finished my coffee, washed the mug, and only then slid open with a letter opener I'd owned for years but rarely used. The contents were brief. A formal notice of intent to challenge enforcement procedures tied to the judgment. Dense language. Hollow threats. A legal maneuver designed not to win, but to delay, to drain attention, time, and emotional energy. I forwarded it to my attorney, without comment. His reply came an hour later. Expected. They're running out of options. Running out, however, didn't mean stopping. The next phase wasn't legal. It was personal. It began subtly. A neighbor mentioned seeing one of my son's cars parked along the access road late one evening. The investigator confirmed it. Footage showed a vehicle idling just beyond camera range, lights off, engine running for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away. No laws were broken. No lines crossed. But the message was clear. I didn't react outwardly. Inside, I adjusted. Routine shifted slightly. Lights turned on in different rooms at different times. My schedule varied. Awareness sharpened. Fear never took hold. But vigilance did. A week later, another attempt arrived, this one disguised as remorse. A long email sent through a mutual acquaintance's account, forwarded to me with apologies and uncertainty. It spoke of regret, of wanting to make things right, of misunderstanding and pain. It asked for one conversation. Just one. I read it once. Then again. The words were carefully chosen, emotionally fluent, technically vague. There was no acknowledgement of specific actions, no responsibility taken, only feelings, hurt, confusion, longing. I deleted it. That night, sleep came slowly, not because I doubted my decision, but because I recognized a strategy. This wasn't reconciliation. It was leverage repackaged. The investigator called the next morning. "They're circling," he said simply, not directly, testing boundaries. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Continue doing exactly what you're doing. Document everything. No engagement." I thanked him and ended the call. That afternoon, I took a drive with no destination. Just roads unfolding one after another. The landscape familiar yet distant enough to allow thought. I passed schools letting out, children spilling onto sidewalks, parents waiting in cars. Life moved forward with, or without permission. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rear view mirror. Older, thinner, calmer. The man looking back at me wasn't broken. He was resolved. Resolution, I realized, was threatening to those who relied on chaos. The escalation came without warning. One evening, as I returned from volunteering, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to be wrong. I froze on the porch, senses sharpening all at once. The security system hadn't alerted. No alarm sounded. I didn't step inside. I backed away slowly and called the investigator first. Then the police. When officers arrived, they conducted a thorough sweep. Nothing was missing. Nothing disturbed beyond the door itself. No signs of forced entry. The system log showed the door had been unlocked using an old code, one that should have been invalidated months ago. Someone knew what they were doing. The officer said quietly. I nodded. I already knew who. That night, I stayed in a hotel. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. The investigator adjusted protocols. Codes changed. Additional sensors installed. Legal notices prepared. The next morning, my attorney filed a restraining order request. This time, the response was swift. Anger spilled out into the open. Voicemails left from block numbers. Messages sent through third parties. Accusations. Threats dressed up as predictions. You'll regret pushing us this far. I didn't listen to the messages in full. I forwarded them unopened. The court hearing was brief. Evidence presented. Patterns established. The order was granted without drama. Clear boundaries, legally enforced. Afterward, I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing evenly. This was the moment many people imagine will feel triumphant. It didn't. It felt final. In the weeks that followed, the noise died down. Not completely, but enough to fade into background static. Attempts dwindled. The energy behind them dissipated. I returned to my routines with renewed intention. The scholarship committee expanded its scope. New donors came forward. New partnerships formed. My wife's name traveled farther than I ever had. Her legacy grew not in defiance, but in generosity. I spent long afternoons reviewing applications, writing notes, imagining futures that didn't yet exist. These students didn't know me. They didn't owe me anything. And yet, they treated the opportunity with reverence. That contrast wasn't lost on me. In late summer, I received an unexpected call from my attorney. They've missed 2 garnishment payments, he said. We've initiated enforcement. It won't change the outcome, but it may provoke a response. Let me know if it does. I replied. It did. 3 days later, a handwritten letter arrived. No return address. The handwriting was familiar enough to recognize instantly. It didn't apologize. It accused. It blamed me for everything. Failures, losses, broken relationships. It painted a narrative where I was cruel, vindictive, cold. It claimed I'd chosen strangers over blood, money over love. I read it slowly, carefully once. Then I folded it, placed in a file labeled correspondence, and locked the drawer. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. The story someone tells about you says more about their needs than your actions. Autumn approached again, full circle. Leaves began to turn. Air cooled. The anniversary of the first phone call crept closer, without ceremony. On that morning, I woke early and sat at the kitchen table with my wife's letter spread out before me. I read it not as a warning this time, but as a record of trust. She had believed I would do the right thing once I knew the truth. She had been right. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery, brought fresh flowers, sat quietly. I'm still listening. I told the headstone, still choosing carefully. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated with a message from the investigator. No activity in 3 weeks. Looks like they're backing off. I smiled faintly, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. Peace, I had learned, isn't given. It's defended once decisively and then maintained through consistency. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch and watched shadows stretch across the yard. The garden was winding down for the season. Soon it would rest. So would I. The past hadn't vanished. It never would, but it had lost its grip. And for the first time since that Thursday morning years ago, I knew deeply without doubt, that nothing was waiting to ambush me anymore. What remained was simply life, unfolding on my terms. Time did what no argument ever could. It created distance, not just in miles and months, but in meaning. The longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became that what had ended wasn't simply a conflict, but an entire way of living. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. Autumn deepened into winter with deliberate slowness. Frost traced patterns along the edges of windows in the mornings, delicate and temporary. I learned to appreciate those small details. The way light broke across the kitchen floor at sunrise, the sound of wind threading through bare branches, the satisfaction of completing a day without interruption. These were not things I'd lacked before. They were things I had been too distracted to notice. The restraining order did its job quietly. No more cars lingering near the drive. No unfamiliar footsteps. No anonymous messages testing the edges of my patience. Boundaries, when enforced without wavering, tend to become uninteresting to people who rely on chaos. That didn't mean the aftermath vanished entirely. Every so often, an update would arrive from my attorney. Dry, procedural, unemotional. Missed payments corrected. Adjustments filed. Compliance restored. The system continued to function exactly as designed, indifferent to anyone's feelings. I found comfort in that. Impartial structures had saved me from my own reluctance to act. In December, the scholarship fund crossed a threshold I hadn't expected so soon. Enough endowment to guarantee annual awards without further fundraising. The committee proposed expanding eligibility. I approved it without hesitation. The announcement went out quietly. No press release, no ceremony, just opportunity made available to people who needed it. One evening, a handwritten thank you note arrived from a student I'd never met. She wrote about studying late nights at a library after work, about believing she'd have to abandon her degree, about crying when she read the award letter. I read her note twice, then placed it beside my wife's letter in the drawer. Different circumstances, same impact. The holidays came and went without fanfare. No decorations beyond a simple wreath on the door. No gatherings. No obligatory cheer. I spent the days volunteering extra shifts, sitting with patients who couldn't go home, listening to stories that had nothing to do with mine. Grief, I'd learned, doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, less demanding, more like a companion than a captor. On New Year's Eve, I stayed home. No resolutions made. No celebrations watched. Just a glass of wine and a notebook open on the table. I wrote without a plan, letting thoughts surface and settle. I wrote about fear, how it disguises itself as obligation. I wrote about love, how it survives honesty, not denial. I wrote about the danger of confusing endurance with virtue. When midnight came, I closed the notebook and went to bed. The new year brought an unexpected development. In late January, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice on the other end was tentative, unfamiliar in its restraint. It was my younger son. "I know I'm not supposed to call," he said quickly before I could speak. "I just listen. I won't take much time." I said nothing. "I'm leaving the state," he continued. "Got a job. It's not great, but it's something. I wanted you to know." There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. Information, offered like a peace token. "I hope you're well," he added, almost as an afterthought. I waited a full 3 seconds before replying. "I wish you stability." I said, nothing more. The line went quiet, then disconnected. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, not shaken, not relieved, just aware. That call marked the true end of something. Not because it resolved anything, but because it confirmed that there would be no resolution, no grand reconciliation, no cinematic closure. And that was enough. February was uneventful. Snow fell, melted, fell again. I took long walks when weather allowed, bundling against the cold, feeling my body respond to movement in ways it hadn't in years. Strength returned slowly. Not youth, but capability. In March, the investigator officially closed my file. "There's nothing more to monitor," he said. "If anything changes, you know how to reach me." I thanked him sincerely. His presence had been a steady line through months of uncertainty. Trust earned quietly. Spring crept back into the landscape, tentative at first. Buds appeared. Grass regained color. The garden called for attention again, and I answered gladly. Working the soil reminded me that renewal is an active process. You don't wait for it. You participate. One afternoon, while kneeling among rows of newly planted herbs, I felt a sudden ache. Not sharp, not alarming. Just the unmistakable reminder of age. I sat back on my heels, breathing steadily, letting the sensation pass. Mortality, like everything else, is easy to face when you're not pretending it doesn't exist. That evening, I reviewed my estate documents again. Not out of fear, but out of diligence. Everything was in order, updated, clear, no ambiguity left to exploit. I made one small adjustment, adding a provision for continued oversight of the scholarship fund for a decade beyond my lifetime. Legacy, I decided, should never depend on goodwill alone. In April, I traveled again, this time domestically, to a coastal town my wife had loved. I walked the same paths we'd once walked together, ate at a small cafe we discovered by accident years earlier. I ordered the same dish she always had. It tasted exactly as I remembered. Sitting by the water, watching waves roll in with unhurried persistence, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't narrating the experience to her in my head anymore. I wasn't measuring it against loss. I was simply there. When I returned home, a package waited on the porch. No note, no return address. Inside was a small object, something I hadn't seen in decades. A watch I'd lost years earlier, one my wife had given me early in our marriage. I recognized the scratch along the bezel instantly. I stood in the entryway holding it, heart steady, mind racing. I checked the cameras. Delivery had been made by a courier service. Paid in cash. No identifying information. I placed the watch on a kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. This wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a reminder. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. He listened without interruption, then spoke calmly. Document it. Secure it. Don't respond. That's exactly what I did. The incident didn't repeat. No follow-up. No message attached. Just one final attempt to reinsert themselves into my awareness. It failed. May arrived warm and bright. The garden thrived. The scholarship committee selected its next cohort. I attended the meeting in person this time, contributing actively, engaged, invested. Afterward, one of the committee members, a woman my age with sharp eyes and an easy smile, invited me for coffee. We talked about education, about volunteering, about travel. We didn't talk about family. It was refreshing. As weeks passed, we met again. No expectations. No urgency. Just conversation. Shared laughter. Mutual respect. The possibility of connection without dependency. I didn't tell her everything. Not because I was hiding, but because I no longer felt the need to explain myself to be understood. Trust, I'd learned, begins with boundaries. By early summer, the past felt distant enough to be manageable, close enough to remain instructive. I carried the lessons with me, not as armor, but as awareness. One evening, while organizing study, I came across the first journal entry I'd written after everything began. The handwriting was tight, controlled, the words heavy with vigilance. I compared it to the most recent entry, looser, calmer, reflective. The difference startled me. Change doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. As the season shifted again, I found myself looking forward more than backward, planning instead of bracing, living instead of guarding. The silence that once felt fragile now felt permanent. And in that permanence, I discovered something I hadn't expected at all. Not closure, but peace that didn't require anyone else's participation. That realization, more than any legal victory or financial protection, was a true turning point, because nothing and no one had power over me anymore unless I chose to give it. The summer settled in gently, without demands. Heat lingered in the afternoons, cicadas stitched sound into the air, and evenings arrived with a softness that made it easy to forget how sharp life had once felt. I let that softness exist without suspicion. Not everything calm is a trap. Some calm is earned. The watch remained where I had placed it, inside a small lockbox in the study, cataloged and photographed, a quiet artifact of an old attempt to reach me. I didn't wear it. I didn't throw it away. It existed as proof of something that no longer mattered. Weeks passed without incident. That, I discovered, was its own kind of test. When conflict ends abruptly, the mind waits for it to resume. It anticipates the next move, the next escalation, the next surprise. I caught myself doing it, listening a little too carefully when a car slowed on the road, checking notifications out of habit rather than necessity. Awareness lingered even after danger receded. Letting go is not the same as forgetting. It's choosing not to rehearse what no longer has a stage. The scholarship program entered a new phase that summer. Applications nearly doubled. Word spread quietly, the way meaningful opportunities often do, through counselors, teachers, community organizers. I spent long evenings reviewing essays, marking passages that revealed grit rather than polish. The committee trusted my instincts now, and I trusted them in return. One application stood out. A student who had lost both parents before finishing high school, who worked nights cleaning offices to pay for textbooks, who wanted to specialize in oncology, not because of personal tragedy, but because of a volunteer experience that had reshaped her understanding of care. Her writing wasn't perfect. It was honest. She was selected unanimously. At the award dinner, she spoke with composure that belied her age. When she finished, she looked directly at me and nodded once, small, respectful, resolute. No tears, no dramatics, just recognition. That nod stayed with me. Afterward, the committee member I'd been seeing, casually, intentionally without labels, walked with me to the parking lot. The night air was warm, the sky clear. "You seem lighter," she said, not as an observation, but as a question. I replied. "I just didn't notice when it happened." She smiled. "That's usually how it goes." We continued seeing each other without urgency. Dinners, walks, conversations that wander without needing to arrive anywhere. We spoke about work, about travel, about the ways life changes shape as you age. We didn't speak about the past unless it served understanding. She didn't push. I didn't retreat. Mutual restraint, I'd learned, can be a form of respect. In late August, a letter arrived from my attorney marked final compliance. Garnishment obligations had been fully recalibrated after months of irregularity. The process would continue without further intervention. No hearing scheduled. No motions pending. I read it once and filed it away. That chapter was officially closed. The following week, I received an email from a former patient, someone I hadn't seen in over a decade. He wrote to thank me for the care I provided long ago, mentioned hearing about the scholarship fund through a local paper. He ended the message with a line that struck deeper than he probably intended. "It's good to see you're still building something that lasts." I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a long time. September approached, bringing with it an anniversary I hadn't marked in years. The date of my wife's diagnosis. In the past, I dreaded it, braced myself for the weight of memory. This year, it arrived without drama. I spent that day volunteering, sat with a woman during her first treatment, listened as she spoke about her children, her fears, her plan for after. When she asked how long I'd been doing this work, I told her the truth. "As long as it's mattered," I said. That evening, I cooked dinner at home. Simple, intentional. I poured a glass of wine and set it by the window. For a moment, I imagined my wife there, not as she'd been at the end, but as she'd been in the middle, capable, sharp, smiling. I didn't speak to her aloud. I didn't need to. Autumn arrived slowly, then all at once. Leaves shifted color almost overnight. The garden wound down, plants giving way to earth. I cleaned the beds, covered the soil, prepared it for rest. Rest, I realize, is not an activity. It's preparation. One afternoon, while organizing garage, I found an old box labeled records. Inside were documents I'd forgotten to discard. Early drafts of wills, outdated insurance policies, notes scribbled during meetings years earlier. Among them was a folded piece of paper I hadn't seen in a long time. It was a list, written in my wife's handwriting. At the top, she'd written, "If anything happens to me." Below were names of charities, ideas for scholarships, notes about mentoring programs. Plans she'd never formalized, never spoken aloud. Dreams deferred, not abandoned. I sat on the concrete floor reading it line by line, the dust rising around me. This list wasn't a warning. It wasn't about protection. It was about contribution. I realized then that everything I'd built since her passing, the trust, the scholarships, the volunteer work, had aligned with this list without my knowing it, as if some part of me had been following a map I hadn't seen. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside her letter. That night, sleep came easily. October brought a small test of my resolve. A voicemail from a blocked number slipped through before the system caught it. The voice was strained, unfamiliar in its desperation. It didn't ask for money. It didn't threaten. It asked for understanding. I listened once. Then I erased it. Compassion does not require proximity. A few days later, I told my attorney about the message. He noted it, advised no response, and that was the end of it. The incident didn't linger. By November, my life had settled into something steady enough to trust. I hosted a small dinner for the scholarship committee. No speeches, no ceremony, just conversation and gratitude. The woman I'd been seeing sat beside me, comfortable, present. At one point, someone asked about my family. I answered simply, "I have a full life," I said. No one pressed further. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, the sound of water steady and grounding. I thought about the man I'd been 3 years earlier, tired, confused, quietly afraid of confrontation. I thought about the man I was now, not hardened, just clear, clear about what I would allow, clear about what I would no longer excuse, clear about what mattered. As winter approached again, I found myself planning for the future, without anxiety. Trips, projects, the next cycle of scholarships, small things, meaningful things. The silence around me felt complete, not fragile, not temporary, complete. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything to happen, because everything that needed to had already been done. Winter arrived the way it always does. Quietly at first, then with unmistakable authority. Frost edged the mornings, the garden rested beneath its cover, and the world narrowed to essentials. I welcomed it. There was something honest about winter, something that didn't pretend to be gentle while demanding endurance. My life no longer felt like something I was defending. It felt like something I was living. The days settled into a rhythm I trusted. Mornings were slow and deliberate. Coffee, reading, a walk if the weather allowed. Afternoons were for work that mattered. Scholarship reviews, volunteer shifts, letters answered thoughtfully instead of urgently. Evenings were mine. Sometimes shared, sometimes solitary, always intentional. The woman I'd grown close to never tried to fill space that wasn't offered. We move at a pace that honored where we both were, older, wiser, uninterested in performance. We talked openly about boundaries, about independence, about how connection thrives when it isn't asked to compensate for old wounds. There were no promises made that needed defending later, just presence, choice, respect. In January, the scholarship fund announced its next cohort. More recipients than the year before. More stories of resilience, of focus, of determination. I read every acceptance letter before it went out, imagining the moment each student would open it. That anticipation, knowing what relief would feel like on the other side of uncertainty, never grew old. One afternoon, after a long meeting, I returned home to find a thin envelope tucked into the mailbox. Handwritten address. No return name. My body reacted before my mind did. A brief tightening that passed as quickly as it came. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't long. No accusations. No demands. Just a few sentences written carefully, almost formally. An acknowledgement that choices had consequences. An admission that things hadn't turned out as planned. No apology, but no blame either. A statement of intent to move forward separately. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the drawer with the others. Not everything needs an answer. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal to a fresh page. I didn't write about the letter. I wrote about the day instead, the laughter at the committee meeting, the satisfaction of a task completed, the quiet contentment of a meal shared. I wrote about how peace doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives as an absence of dread. In early spring, I took one final trip. Not far, just a place my wife and I had once visited on a whim, a stop we'd always said we'd return to. I walked the same streets, sat on the same bench overlooking the water. This time, I didn't feel the urge to narrate the moment to anyone else. I simply watched the tide move in and out, steady and unconcerned. Back home, I made a decision that surprised me only because it felt so natural. I downsized again, not out of necessity, but preference. A smaller place closer to town, easier to maintain, closer to the people and work that mattered now. The sale was straightforward. The move even more so. Letting go had become a practice skill. On the anniversary of my wife's passing, I visited the cemetery early in the morning. The air was cool, the grounds quiet. I brought flowers, sat on the bench, and spoke softly, not to explain, not to seek approval, but to acknowledge. You trusted me. I said, I didn't waste that. I left a letter with her name laminated and tucked safely away in my wallet. Some things don't belong anywhere else. That afternoon, I hosted a small gathering, nothing formal. A few committee members, a couple of neighbors, the woman who had become part of my life without demanding it. We ate simply, laughed easily, and talked about what came next, projects, plans, possibilities. No one asked about the past. It no longer defined the room. As the evening wound down and guests drifted away, I stood alone in the doorway for a moment, watching taillights disappear down the street. The quiet that followed felt complete, not hollow, earned, not borrowed. Before bed, I wrote one last entry in the journal that had carried me through everything. I protected what mattered. I chose clarity over comfort, truth over tradition, and intention over fear. I didn't lose a family. I found myself. I closed the book and turned out the light. Outside, the night was calm. No footsteps. No waiting. No unresolved tension humming beneath the surface. Just life, steady and honest, moving forward. And that was enough. If my story stayed with you, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Thank you for watching.